just kick things off. Welcome everyone, thank you for joining. Welcome to the first of Create Street's Planning Forward webinars. And a big thank you to Andrew Taylor and to Countryside, who are kindly making it happen. My name is Nicholas Boy-Smith. I'm not one of the panelists, but I am going to hand over to Andrew, who is chairing a very topical discussion on design codes. So welcome everyone, and thank you. And Andrew.
Nicholas, thank you very much, and can I add my welcome to yours as well to all the people who have attended. And as Nicholas said, this is a very topical discussion. So design over the last few years, design and quality have been raising up the political and professional agendas for a range of different very good reasons. And over the last year or two, we've seen significant effort by MHCLG in the National Design Guide and then more recently in the National Model Design Code to improve quality of development nationally. And today's session is focusing on design codes or design guides, as you both are talked about. And we're going to hear a presentation by Andy van Bradsky and David Rudlin, who I'll introduce in a moment, talking about the work that they've been involved in preparing the National Model Design Code and the way that they see that interacting across the country. We've then open up to responses from Alice Lester and Esther Kurland and myself from three different perspectives, looking at the code and the implementation and the impact that we expect things to happen. After that, we'll be able to move on, hopefully, to lots and lots of questions from yourselves in the Q&A function. There are two functions, the chat and the Q&A, but questions in the Q&A, please, and then we will try and pick up, consolidate some into questions to the whole panel to be able to get responses. We will try and do as many questions as we can, but we will obviously conclude by about 9:30. So that's the running order of the session. I will hand over to Andy and David, but Andy is head of architecture at MHCLG with a very long and distinguished career, which you can read about when you Google him if you want to. And David is a director of URBED and has been one of the guiding lights behind the production of the code, retained by MHCLG to do that. So if I hand over to Andy and David to take us through their presentation. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Thank you very much to Create Streets and to Countryside for organising this event. It's one of a number you can imagine that we're being invited to, and this is one of the first. So this gives myself and David a really good opportunity to share some detail around what we've arrived at with the National Model Design Code. I'll say a few words by introduction and say what it's all about and what the purpose of it is. It has been co-produced with URBED, so delighted that David can maybe explain more fully the detail around the process for coding. I'm going to then close up with a few words about what's happening next, and we'll try and rattle through this as quickly as we can so that there's a lot of time for discussion. So next slide, David. So you'll know that on 30th of January we made a series of announcements, and I won't go through them in detail, but it is worth mentioning the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission response that government issued to Nicholas's excellent report, which was issued, and that triggered a whole series, I think, of changes that have been made to the National Planning Policy Framework, the creation of the code itself, Office of Place, and I'll talk later about the pilots. Amendments to the NPPF quite significant, and I won't go into them in detail, but you will know that it places more emphasis on coding in the revised document. Next slide. So this is, as Andrew said, a movement by government to strengthen design quality in the planning system. The NPPF, both 2018 and the revised version, places a lot of significance on design quality, planning practice guidance that supports that has been produced, and the National Design Guide, of course, published in October 2019. And really all these suites need to be read together, and that's quite an important issue, which I will come back to. Material consideration, of course, in the planning decision making. Next slide. So these are the documents. They'll be familiar to you now. They're online, accessible on gov.uk. They are really for local planning authorities. They're pitched towards giving them more information, almost a toolkit to inform them about how to do local design codes or guides or policies. So within the planning system as it currently stands, that would typically be an SPD. We also have made very significant emphasis on local community engagement and participation, and we expect that this suite of documents can be used much more widely in terms of informing planning decisions. Next slide. I mentioned the National Design Guide and the suite of documents being read together. It is important that we see the National Design Guide as the foundation, the principles being set out, and that the National Model Design Code and the guidance notes that support it are the how-to and how to deliver that objective that have been set out in the main code. So we do refer in the National Model Design Code to the 10 characteristics of well-designed places, and David will talk a bit more about that. I mean, fundamentally, this is about a toolkit that needs to be developed for, it needs to be used to develop local design codes modelled entirely on their local circumstances. Really important point. This isn't anything other than a process and a series of guidance notes for local authorities to develop their own codes. Next. Its strength in the guidance notes, it's just worth mentioning that we took great cognizance of the emerging guidance that is coming out of DEFRA, from DFT, from BAYS, on the latest sort of most important issues to do with manual for streets, the environment, green infrastructure standards, climate change, and we even refer to how the coding can actually support modern methods of construction. Next. And then finally, for me, this is much more emphasis on local engagement. So how does the community engage in this? And we've heard the phrase many a time, bringing the democracy forward. So when you do codes and you put them in local plans, how do we know that communities support the local design codes? What are the processes for getting engagement and participation from communities in that? So the guidance notes actually adds a sort of weight to and guidance notes that help direct that, whether it's face-to-face, which clearly at the moment much more tricky, but also social media, visualization techniques, and so on. And a key challenge, I guess, and we'll probably come on to talk about it, is how you measure the support. What is the support and how do you endorse it? I'm going to hand over to David.
David, you're on mute, and we've just gone off full screen as well. That's better.
So sorry about that. I realised that when I was sharing my screen, I couldn't find the unmute button. So I was either sharing a screen or muted. So apologies for that. Thank you, Andy. I just want to sort of take forward the story a little bit there. It's a brief presentation this morning. If you've seen us do this before, this is a slightly shorter version. I wanted to really start by saying that working really closely with the MHCLG team, we did a lot of thinking about what code actually was, and in doing so, we did some international case studies. We looked at other codes that have been produced in the UK, and we had a lot of discussions with I think 150 odd people in terms of the code. And actually, the difference between a code and a guide in many ways is that a code is got a geographical specificity to it, and that can either be to a whole local authority. it can be to an area type, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, to a particular development site, and it needs to refer down to what happens on a plot. And so whereas a guide is sort of gives you guidance about how to do things, the code then makes that guidance specific to a particular geographical element. The coding process, which is set out in part 1 of the guide, is based upon 3 broad steps, which are broken down into 7 sub-steps. And I'm just going to briefly go through how we see that coding process working. The first thing is the scoping process. And the key thing here is to answer 2 questions. The first is what geographical area you wish the guide to cover. Is it going to cover the whole of your district? Is it going to cover only part of the district? Is it going to cover just new development, or new development and changes to the existing built fabric? So the first question is the geographical coverage of the code. The second is the content of the code. Now, as Andy said, the content is based upon the 10 elements of the National Urban Design Guide and National Design Guide, sorry. And so we follow the same format, but it may well be that some of those things aren't things that you wish to cover in your design code. It doesn't mean they're not important. It means that you may wish to cover them elsewhere in your policy agenda. So things that you will almost certainly want to put in the code include movement, nature, built form and density, public spaces and uses. Things like homes and buildings, building standards, resources, lifespan management, and so on, maybe things which you want to cover elsewhere. So the second part of scoping is to look at the elements that the code are going to cover. Skipping forward a bit in the process, clearly I'm skipping over things like analysis and so on, because people on the call will no doubt be aware of that background. So the key stage is this plan, which we call the coding plan. And this, first of all, shows the area that you're covering with the code, but it then importantly divides the area up into a set of character areas, which we're calling area types. Now, these are areas of relatively consistent urban character. It could, for example, be interwar suburbs or Victorian terraces. They don't have to be. I mean, this is something we're interested in the scoping, the pilot process, to see how easy it is to define these things. But basically, the idea is that you'll have up to 10 probably in your district. You may only have 1. It may well be that you have a consistent area and you only have 1 area type. This is entirely to be defined locally. We've shown 10 possible area types here. These are not to be chosen from, as it were. These are just examples of what you might do. So, you know, we have high-rise cities, we have town and city centres, industrial areas, business and science parks, local centres, and then urban neighbourhoods, suburbs, outer suburbs, villages, and rural settlements. So, just an example of how those things would be calibrated. The coding map also shows the dotted black lines on that plan, shows the development sites. Now, these are things that would be allocated in the local plan, and therefore they are, some people have criticised the code for not giving guidance about where these sites should be. That's actually not the job of the code. The local plan decides where development goes. The code takes off from the point where the site has been allocated. And the development sites clearly need to be master planned before they the area types can be applied to them. This is probably going to happen with the landowner or the developer. It may happen with the local authority, but a plan needs to be produced for each of the development sites, so the area types can then be applied to that. And then once you've got a system where your area covered by the code is divided into area types, your master plans for your development sites have the area types applied, then you can then apply a set of rules to each of the developments in that area based upon the code. That's how it essentially works. So we go on to the third stage of the process, and this is in 2 parts. And the first part is to look at the rules that vary by area type. So we've based it in the guidance on 3 example area types. So these are just examples. They're not intended to be the only ones that you do. So we look at town centres, we look at urban neighbourhoods and suburbs, and you'll see down below there we've given an indication of the sort of parameters that you might apply to this. Again, purely illustrative. And again, we've had conversations and with people like Nicholas about in as far as possible, the rules should be specific. They should be calibrated, and so they can a figure can be put to them, or they should have yes/no answers. And so, in as much as it's possible, and clearly there are many rules where you can't do this, but in as much as it's possible, the idea is that the guidance in the code is clear, and it's very clear about whether a scheme follows that guidance or not. The guidance on area types is set out like this. We have a brief statement, a summary statement. We have a set of example rules about how you might frame rules. We then show the how they would be illustrated for the 3 example area types, and then we have a summary diagram showing what they would mean in practice. These then all cross-reference to the guidance notes, which look a bit like this, which are much more detail in terms of each of the elements of the code, and again give you guidance about the way in which you might put the settings into your code. So using the 2 documents together, you can work out how the code would be structured, and then the guidance about what the content might be. Clearly, we're working with the whole country, so we're not specific on any of this stuff. We're covering everything from the centre of large cities to small villages. So the guidance needs to be very much determined locally, but what we've given, hopefully, is a structure to allow that to happen. Now, let me hand back to Andy to talk about the pilot programme.
Thank you, David. That was a very quick fly through, and hopefully it stimulates a lot of discussion. Just where we are at the moment, you will know that the MPPF changes are required to be consulted upon. So we have an 8-week period where the MPPF is under review. We'd invite any comments coming forward during that period, which closes on the 27th of March. And during that period, we are also expecting comments on the National Model Design Code. So that was an early commitment that the ministers made to consult on the code itself. So any comments you might have on the code would be expected to be submitted during that 8-week period. You'll also know that we, at the same time as announcing launching the code, we announced a testing programme, and expression of interest were issued on gov.uk, closed on Monday. I have to say we've had a significant response to that. I can't give you too much detail because we're working our way through a very big pile of applications, and the objective there is really to take what we've been doing collectively and seeing how local authorities will apply the principles of that. And the criteria for looking at for nominating the 10 successful local authorities is what aspects we expect to be tested in the code, how it might apply to an area, how it might be applied in practice with developers, with communities. So we're expecting over the next few months to test this document and see whether it's appropriate, needs to be changed, etc. So that's 10 pilots which will be running from March through till September. And following the changes to the National Model Design Code document, after consultation, we'll be issuing another invitation to local authorities to come forward for a further 10 pilots based on the finalised documents. And we will be involving Office for Place in both of these initiatives, just to make sure that we're gathering enough information to inform any changes that might occur to the planning system into the future. There is a training programme that we're looking at. We're doing a film. We're trying to promote this as much as we possibly can. And I have to say, just judging by the number of people in the audience today, we're getting significant interest in this, and it bodes well for the application of coding in the planning system into the future. Thank you, Andrew. Back to you.
Andy, David, thank you very much. And I think the pilot projects will be really interesting things to watch over the next 3 months and 6 months. And no doubt the learning that will come from that will be disseminated out much broader. I'm now going to move first to Alice and then to Esther to give a sort of a slightly sectoral response. So Alice is, what are you, Alice? Operational Director for Regeneration, Growth and Employment at Brent. Nice long title. But previously also Head of the Planning Advisory Service, so a very local government focused response. So Alice, would you like to sort of give some views and response, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew, and to Andy and David, and thank you for asking me here. Yeah, so just a quick run through. Now, we know this is quite new and it's got a long way to run with the pilots, etc. So these are sort of very initial thoughts. We haven't thought everything through yet about the implications, but I'll just run through a few initial thoughts of mine, not necessarily my organisation's. First of all, I think I'd like to say that I think these are some of the best documents I've seen come out of government for years and years and years, so that's really refreshing to see. And I think one of the main reasons is that it's a very clear and sort of promising sign from government that it is committed to good quality design, and also that the absolute recognition that most of us in the sector know, but politicians don't always know, that design is much more than about what a building looks like, and it is about place, and as we've said as you said with the criteria, it's about movement and connectivity and interactions and public realm, etc., etc. So I think that's great, and it's a very refreshing signal that perhaps the government is introducing something which isn't just about counting numbers of houses and that absolute pressure to drive the housing numbers up, that it is more important than that. So I think that's really good. And it recognises that development and placemaking is a much more complex discussion than just about style, the type of windows and what a building looks like. So definite thumbs up for that. Even though the phrase or the word beauty is still used throughout some of the documents in the NPPF, I feel this is a slight shift of sophistication beyond the use of that very subjective word, because it made me laugh when in the white paper we had beauty as exemplified by what was it? I was going to say Bolsover, it wasn't. It was Bath, Belgravia and Bourneville. Well, I'm from Brent. Brent starts with B. Didn't quite fit that narrative, but there are certainly parts of Brent that I think a lot of people who live there would say are beautiful. So that phrase always worried me. I think it's a really useful suite of documents for applicants, planners and members. I do find at Planning Committee, despite the fact we have done some urban design training, that to them design is about the height of a building, and it's very hard to take some people beyond that, and I think these documents will really help with that. So it's a really useful suite of documents, and the principles are all good. I mean, this is what planning's about, isn't it? And I think those of us who've sort of worked for a long time in the sector and the industry know that this is what planning is about. It's such a shame that we've had to do this to be able to seek to secure good developments that follow these principles. But, you know, really, really glad that these documents have come out and it's an art of the planning system now. Finally, really, really glad that it will be piloted. So, but what worries me, there are a few things that worry me. I'm really, really worried about the capacity of local authorities to pick this up and run with it and implement it properly. It does feel like it's a significant ask on top of the work that we're already doing, and haven't quite thought through or worked out or read enough about how this may link with the planning white paper changes, which may or may not come through if we've got those timescales to produce a local plan, which are quite tight, and we've got to do this alongside. It's really a lot of in-depth work. Which takes time. It's not just bums on seats. It is the months that you have to go through this work. So very worried about that, and the extent to which we're going to be able to get in-house expertise or procure external consultants to help us with that. I mean, we've already got a tall building strategy. We've got 2 SPDs on design. We've got at least 2 master plans on the go. I believe we're embedding these principles in them already, but slightly concerned about the sort of the extra work that we might have to review those documents that are already in place. I'm slightly worried, less so than I was after the white paper, about stifling innovation. I very much believe planning is about change, and I know that that the whole rhetoric around matching the existing character of an area, quite often I believe that character needs changing actually, and it can be improved. I like to think that we're creating the conservation areas and the listed building of the future, and sometimes that means you need to be radical and move away from replicating what you've already got on the ground. Not always, but just sometimes. So I want to make sure that our plans can do that. I think, so Andy or David, one of you or both of you referred to sort of the local circumstances and codes reflecting that in a quite dense, urban environment, which is very varied and diverse, like Brent. I think this is going to be the volume, or how we choose where we do design codes for and what happens where we don't, is going to be really difficult, because all of our town centres are different. Do we just look at our site allocations, of which we have around 30 odd? Do we look at our growth areas, of which we have 9? How do we look at our suburban? What do we do? So we've got to think through all of this, but again, it's going to be very constrained by the resources we have. Finally, I think hopefully there will be support from inspectors if something's refused because of design, particularly if it is a major housing development, because again, whilst we've got these housing targets, are we going to have tension? We have, sorry, not finally, one more point quickly. We have a lot of pressure to build dense developments that go up. We don't have the land to go out. We can only go up if we're going to provide the housing numbers that we want to. And the public don't like it, to be honest. I mean, I completely get the principle of bringing the public with you, the locals, etc. But they do not like these tall buildings. They do not like them. And I think it'll be very hard for us to come with a design code that has the support of the local population, that also meets our housing ambitions. So we're going to have to look quite carefully at that. And yeah, finally, I think, properly finally, I mean, one of the roles of a planner and the decision maker is to take loads of different aspects of the development into account. It's the economic considerations about the commercial offer and the job creation, etc. It's about wider ambitions of the council. It isn't just about what the local population think about the design, even in its widest sense, of the building. And sometimes we have to accept compromises to achieve the benefits that a scheme may bring. We have to compromise on some other things. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Alice, that's great, thank you. And a few key themes there that are also linked to some of the questions, the resources for local authorities, the training officers and councillors, and also that local buy-in, the democratic element, whatever that is, how do you get that buy-in from local people about the design codes? Esther, Director at Urban Design London, hand over to you, please, for your perspective on what's been produced.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much, everybody, for this morning. It's great to see so many people who are interested in this. I was going to say loads of the same things as Alice, and totally agree with everything she said. We work with local authorities, providing training, support and advice. So see a lot of the same positive reactions to what's come out recently, but also concerns and practical worries about how to take it forward. So rather than just saying the same things as Alice, I'd like to just introduce a slightly different take on where we are, and that's about sort of more generally about planning, about good planning, and the tensions within about certainty. So what we're trying to do, I think, here is say there's more certainty for a community, there's more certainty for the planners and the investment elements, or infrastructure investment elements of planning, and there's more certainty for developers upfront on what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed, or at least a baseline of what's going to be allowed. Because if things meet a code or meet a guide, the principle is that they're going to go forward for that area. But if you want to do something different, then there's, you make your case for that. So there is potential for innovation. So there's more a baseline certainty. And this is something that I think planning reforms over the last 20, 30 years have tried to achieve. This tension between people wanting certainty, but not being able to get it unless they do enough design work to show the impact of change. So I was around at CABE many years ago when we were looking at design and access statements, and the argument there, the whole thing about them was about, should we have outline planning permissions or not? Because outline planning permissions set certainty for what basically the amount and possibly the access arrangements and the use on a site, but they don't test it out in terms of the built form. So some people are saying we shouldn't use outline applications because it gives principle for something that might be terrible in the end. Whereas others are saying we need outline applications because it allows us to look at how we invest and how we can get the money and how we can take a scheme forward early on without investing too much time and money in the design area work there. And I think what we're looking at now in terms of the codes based on character appraisals, which are not like design guides, which are either householder design guides or shopfront design guides, but they are locality design, you know, for a certain area, with is kind of the same kind of conversation around saying, well, we've tested out what the baseline acceptability in this area is going to be, in the same way as an outline planning application might do. And therefore that proactive upfront work has been done to help move the system forward a bit. So I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but I think what we're looking at is a really important addition to the planning toolkit to allow for good planning. And I do think it's good planning. It's not just about design or built form. So it is sitting alongside design guides, for example, householder design guides, sitting alongside master plans, site briefs, and other specific tools that get used, and adding to that that sort of that basket of opportunity to really plan properly. As Alice said, there's lots of problems there in terms of who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, how they're going to get paid for doing it, what's the best mechanisms. We don't particularly want to go back to lots of local authorities buying in pieces of work which they then don't use. And apologies if there's anyone on the call whose job is doing the old style character appraisals, but I always used to think that local authorities are paying 50 grand for a character appraisal of their borough, local authority area to be done, which created a great coffee table book because it just said, this is what it's like in this area, but it didn't go to the next level of saying, and so this is how it should change. And I think what we're talking about now is taking that character appraisal methodology, using it as the baseline, and the codes are the and so. So that's kind of taking it much better into a much more practical application opportunities there. So I think it's really positive. I do think it's about much more what things look like. I think the codes are going to potentially need to think about some of the pressures on the way places need to work and demands on them post-COVID, which I don't think they are yet. So the flexible use of buildings and homes, promoting local living, more working from home, etc., etc., etc. So I think there's sort of maybe when David and Andy look back at the model design code in a few months' time, there may be some new stuff that might be cropping up. I do think there is a massive amount of tension between the housing numbers and PD and what we're talking about today. And this comes forward from local authorities all the time saying, well, how, and from communities saying, well, how can you be so kind of really proactive and focused on things that need planning permission through coding them, but at the same time put pressure on those codes to deliver housing numbers, which seems still to trump the design quality, but maybe that's going to change. I think the MBBF is really helpful there. Hopefully there will be a bit of a balance, but particularly with PD. And I do think that there is kind of like, well, there's this whole argument, well, you know, okay, what I'm doing, maybe it won't meet the design code for that area, but actually I could do something very similar under PD, put some extra floors on something or whatever it is. So kind of, should we be looking to make sure that those permitted development and prior notification rules or parameters actually sit much more comfortably with coding what comes out in local codes, so that there isn't a two-tier system where it's more stringent and more considered and more locally specific if you need planning permission, and more gung-ho and you can do whatever, and impact isn't really considered well enough when you don't need express planning permission. So I think that's an area that will continue to be discussed, and I think it's political, unfortunately, so I don't know what to say about it. Yeah, that's enough, I think, for now. So I didn't want to say what Alice said, so what I prepared, I didn't say that. But I hope that that's like, this is about good planning, and it's a really important tool to be proactive, to reset where that certainty sits, certainty of what can be developed. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the trials work. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks so much. I'm going to just touch briefly on sort of a developer perspective and response. So generally, I'm very positive about the document and the route map moving forward, and it does provide that certainty that Esther mentioned, and it provides a bit more clarity, which developers do certainly want and strive for when they're looking at all sorts of sites, but certainly larger sites. We do have to be careful about the danger, though, of tying everything down at day one. And when we're working on some very large sites, it might be 10, 15 years in development. And actually, one of the things that we need to make sure that codes can do is change over time and be able to respond to that changing environment and changing needs. And Alice talked about different views and changes over time, being able to respond and have that insightful moment, perhaps, where you suddenly all decide that you want to do something a bit different. So we need to be able to respond to that, and we need to make sure that while there is that certainty, we're also able to be flexible enough, because the one thing I always guarantee on master plans and codes is something will change over the life of the development, and therefore we need to be able to respond to that. But the focus on design and quality is good. Being able to bring up the quality of developments across the country, I think, is important, and bring them up to a level that we can all be proud of. And that's something that Countryside certainly would like to see happen across the board. One of the things that we've touched on a little bit, Andy mentioned that the guides are targeted at local authorities. And one of the points I would like to get across is the only way that codes are going to be successful is that they are jointly produced and they are deliverable and realistic. And that co-production, the joint production of design codes and guides, is incredibly important. So working jointly with the developer, promoter of the site, with the local council, and yes, local residents as well, or future residents, is really important to make sure that whatever comes out is deliverable and practical. And I think that's something that we do need to see coming through in the testing program, how that balance works in terms of the joint working. I also think there's some things that they shouldn't cover. These are documents that sit as part of a broader local plan and a broader narrative of planning policy. And we should make sure that they don't add to the overall policy presumption or policy basis of a local area, but they add the detail to the policy that's already there. And certainly, I wouldn't want to see things encroach onto, for example, building regulation areas and focus on that rather than the creation of the place and the design of buildings. But I do want to end on the comment about local planning authority resources and the ability for local authorities to be able to respond timely, because what we don't want to do is this process add a significant amount of time to the delivery of key homes and key regeneration areas and key new sites. And that's going to be quite a concern for a lot of people to see that this is an additional burden. Yes, possibly a welcome one, but an additional burden in terms of timeliness. And we need to make sure that local authorities are resourced up sufficiently. So that was all I was going to say in terms of a developer perspective. We've got a great range of questions, so thanks very much for all of those. I'm going to chuck something at perhaps Andy to start with, in terms of how he sees the local authorities being able to respond in terms of resources, and how he sees some of these issues. A number of comments also about local communities getting involved, and about how you see that melting pot coming together and local authorities being able to respond in a timely manner. Alice talked about some of the other burdens in terms of producing local plans and just general planning work that's going on, but how from MHCLG's perspective do you see this being resourced at a local level?
So this is about capability and capacity and skills within local authorities. And I think we've been quite clear that there is an issue there to address. And we recognise that many local authorities don't have the skills in-house to do that, and will rely quite heavily on partnering with the private sector and with consultants. The setting up of Office for Place, which is now entitled, and of course, congratulations to Nicholas for his role in that. It is specifically set up to try and address some of those issues, and the design body steering group, which currently exists, and is discussing just this sort of issue, and we'll come to some conclusions around that in terms of what support local authorities will need and where. And of course, Esther's design network, the Urban Design London group, the whole network of support that is available to local authorities ought to be brought into play. So we're actually talking about how that might happen. A survey has been done to actually assess the amount of skills that are out there and the kind of support that local authorities might need. So this is all part and parcel of the piloting as well. You know, we want to see how this can all be brought together. How do local authorities get communities involved? What are the skills that they need to do that? And there's a clear issue about that, I think. It's not just about urban design or architecture or landscape, it's also about community engagement. And I think that probably is one of the biggest tasks, rather than the capability of built environment professionals. It's just, we want to see how local authorities will respond to that particular challenge of community engagement.
Esther, can I follow that up with you, perhaps in talking about the community relationships, perhaps neighbourhood plans and the relationship there, and also in terms of that training aspect and how we can equip, you know, both councillors and lay people to be involved properly within this process?
Yeah, of course. When it comes to training, there's different levels depending on what people need to do. So if somebody in a local authority is going to actually be creating a code, they need different skills and knowledge than a councillor or another officer who is maybe procuring it or using it or explaining or working with the community on it or talking to the community about how it's going to work. So there's all sorts of different skills and different levels within this whole area of work. And as Andy said, there's work going on about kind of trying to start to map that, to understand who needs to do what and therefore what they need to know about, and then how to provide that for them and help them to develop those skills, that skill and knowledge, and capacity. Capacity is massively important here as well. And we've been struggling, we run events for local authorities and struggling trying to find how to fund it. So design review, many people on the call today may know about design review. Design review, a few years ago, there wasn't much of it going on, and what there was funded by government through what was CABE. Now there's loads of it going on, and it's funded by developers through the pre-application process and the fees that they pay at that point. But we're talking about codes coming before the pre-application process. So how do we capture the value of good coding and character appraisal work and plan making at that very early stage, the value that gives to developers, for example, or others? How do we capture that value and make sure the resources are there to do it from that value in the same way the design review has worked? I don't know the answer to that yet, but it seems like it's the golden ticket or golden bullet to be able to make this whole world work better. Because other than that, you know, to the numbers of people who need training and support and the capacity building in local authorities so that they can help and work well with communities, as well as support directly to communities, is a massive mountain. And we're just not at the scale of delivering support at the moment that is going to overcome that. But, you know, if it works, then incrementally that will expand, it will get better. But we need to find a business model that makes it work.
Esther, thank you. And something for Andy to note down, perhaps in the pilots, the relationship between the neighbourhood level and the district level is something, the neighbourhood plan and the local plan, and how we work together and how those relationships, something to pilots could take forward.
Yeah, I'll leave somebody else to talk about neighbourhood planning, but
that's fine. Alice, I'm interested in that relationship at different tiers of government. So looking at the you in London with the GLA and that relationship, and then with your local communities. I don't know whether you have neighbourhood forums in your borough, but if you're thinking more broadly for the local government family, you know, that the county council, the district council and the parish council level, and those relationships and the different impacts that they have and how people should be working together. I don't know if you can pick up a comment in relation to that.
Okay, well, I've only ever worked for London authorities, so I've no experience of parish councils, etc. But well, I mean they're an essential building block, aren't they? I mean in Brent we've got 3 neighbourhood forums, we've got 2 neighbourhood plans, so they are an obvious community-led forum that we should go to utilise their local knowledge really, and use that. And I would say, you know, the same in outside of urban areas where you've got, or outside of unitary areas where you've got parish councils. I mean, they are obvious source of local knowledge. But again, I think a lot of the people will have instinctive feelings about what good design is, but perhaps not be totally on top of the sort of the 10 principles that we've got in the guide. So there will be a big training need there, I think. Yeah, the role of the GLA in the London plan, well, yeah, that'll be interesting to see that plays out. Is it a strategic issue? Well, good design is a strategic issue, I suppose, but actually the local aspect of it, I wouldn't say is a strategic issue for the GLA to really want to get involved in, or need to get involved in, other than encapsulating the design principles which are in the code. I mean, I think that's a really good point of Esther. It's not just, I'll say urban design skills that you need within the borough. We need the community engagement skills as well, because at the moment I guess in Brent, we're probably pretty traditional in that mostly at pre-application stage, the engagement is down to the developer to do that with the community. With the planning applications, we do it the fairly traditional: post a letter, send an email, put a site notice on a lamppost. I know that's all being looked at as part of the white paper, with more intensive local interaction on sort of regeneration schemes and the master planning and the estate regeneration, etc., where we do focus much more on get out and about on the streets. But I've got one, I mean, we deal with 4,500 applications a year, around 50 of which are major applications. I've got one urban designer, a very, very good urban designer, but one urban designer. So all of his time is taken up commenting on planning applications and doing the local plan work. And actually contributing to the master planning, etc. But you know, he's absolutely stretched really, really thinly. So that, yeah, I'll just come back to that. But and a bit like it has been with recruiting planners as well. If I did get funding or an establishment post for an additional urban designer, if I went out to advert, I don't know how many urban designers are out there. Actually, I don't know what the capacity of the country is to provide the urban designers or people with associated skills to be able to deliver this work. But the pilots will hopefully help tease all of that out.
And I think that's actually a really important point, Alice. It's not, there isn't a magic bank of people that we can draw on. It's not just about pulling in consultants or going and employing someone if those people aren't there. Moving on in terms of that relationship and the different people that need to be involved, David, I'm interested in, and there's a few comments about highways and how that comes in. But if I can take it slightly harder than, you know, sight lines and things, that relationship between a county council and the functions that they have and the district council, but how do you see all those different functions coming together, the different levels you need to pull together in terms of that design code, and how do we see, and when Andy wants to comment, you know, the other guides that are out there and design approaches, manuals in relation to hard infrastructure, and about how this is going to be linked in with design codes. David, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had a lot of conversations about streets and highways as part of the development of the code. Streets are far too important to be left to highway engineers is the first principle, I think, of this. I mean, because actually they are the spaces where we all live. And we've been trying to work out when we're doing the code about the points where the urban design concern sort of ends and the manual for streets, the element comes in. And clearly manual for streets is in the process of being updated, and that will be very important when it comes out. And we need to make sure the two things link together. In terms of the practical implication, outside London, or outside the cities, you have this dichotomy that the county does highways and the district does planning, and that is always where in my experience, where the problems arise. And you have a bunch of county engineers who haven't actually picked up on manual for streets its first iteration, let alone the new one coming out in many respects. And so actually having a code which allows you to focus on those issues when you're dealing with larger schemes, I think is actually really important. So the engineers know that the streets are not just about traffic, they're about the creation of place, and these two things need to link together. I also wanted to say very quickly, I've been having a fascinating conversation over the last week with a parish council doing a neighbourhood plan, who said that we've been, all these issues have been sort of wrapped up in this complexity of sort of professional expertise, and the code actually makes it really clear. This stuff isn't as complicated as we thought. It's amazing that when you set it out in simple steps, this is what people are talking about. And actually, I think the problem we have with urban design is we're forever reinventing the wheel. And what we've hopefully done is given a process, which means you don't need to do that. You can actually sort of fit the parameters into a structure which the code gives you. I think this stuff isn't as complicated, actually, as people like to make it out.
Can I just come in and just add to that? I think the point being made several times about it's not how buildings look, it's how places function. And the spaces between buildings are clearly as important, if not more so, than what buildings look like. And we have really engaged positively with Department for Transport, who are positively engaged in this whole process of improving the spaces between buildings, the emphasis on walking and cycling. The point Esther made about, post-COVID sort of design is already sort of, it's got roots into this code that, we've engaged positively with DEFRA on the open space and the green infrastructure issues, the street trees emphasis, in the NPPF now, that, there's clearly much more of an awareness of the space between buildings and how we design that. And just, working with DFT on the Manual for Streets update, you'll see quite a significant shift, I think, in the use of Manual for Streets, and it is running, hopefully, alongside the use of the code in the future. And just final point, I think it was made about updating and making sure that we have a document that keeps abreast of policy. I think this is something we will have to do. We agreed that the National Design Guide itself needed to be refreshed over time. So yeah, we'll be ensuring that this isn't just one document that stands alone and is fixed. It just needs to be constantly reviewed.
Andy, thanks. That's really helpful. It's good to hear about the work on a Manual for Streets as well, and updates to that. Perhaps the last topic of conversation really is about the delivery aspect, and it's all very well having great high goals in codes and setting those out at that level, but it's then the delivery of it. And I'm going to ask perhaps David and Alice to comment on that. How do we make sure, I mean, people have used the word enforcement, but enforcement's a harsh word, isn't it? How do we ensure that the quality that is captured within the codes can be delivered on the ground? I mean, Alice, you must have teams that have this all the time. You have a great scheme that you've approved and taken through planning, and oh dear, it didn't quite make out when the detail got there. But Alice first, perhaps, do you want to be able to comment on this actually delivery point?
Well, I'll try and comment. I certainly haven't got an answer, and in fact that was one thing I didn't say earlier, is about guaranteeing the build quality, because we all see what we call the value engineering downwards. Once a scheme's got consent, the endless chipping away, and I suppose what we've got to be able to do is have the ability to look cumulatively at the little changes that keep coming in, because actually we're just changing this one aspect of the scheme might be fine, and it's hard, isn't it? Because if we've granted permission for a scheme, we want it to be built. We don't then want to have to stop it being built because of our discussions about minor alterations or small alterations or whatever. But there has to be some kind of commitment from applicants and developers that, aside from the things that happen when you're on a construction site and have to be changed, but that the design value is not engineered downwards, but what the mechanism for ensuring that is. So I don't think it's through planning enforcement or refusing changes, really. I don't know what that mechanism is. Anybody got any ideas?
David, then
extra work on the local authority?
So David, how is that code, that delivery aspect, and then also possibly in terms of refreshing codes over their life?
I mean, I think it's interesting that urban design is a very arm's length profession. I noticed Umbretta Romis is on the call today, and I've been working with Umbretta looking at defining the discipline of urban design. And unlike architecture, where basically the architect can supervise what gets built on site, the urban designer writes a set of rules and then goes away, and it tends to get delivered by others. Either to an outline planning application, and my day job as a master planner, we're forever being engaged for the outline consent and then not engaged for the reserved matters, and you see the whole thing slide after the consent's been granted. And in a sense, the code is a similar thing. You are creating a code and then you're leaving it to its own devices to be implemented going forward. And that's both the frustration and also the joy of urban design, because it is that sort of collaborative exercise. I would say that the key thing in a code, and I go back to my early days working on the Guide to Development in Manchester, is the political commitment to see it implemented. So in Manchester, mid-90s, the Guide to Development was introduced, and very quickly the developers in Manchester realised the council were serious about it. And then schemes came in pre-approved, as it were, because they actually took on board the code in the application. You didn't have all those difficult conversations in development management or development control, as it was called at the time, because the scheme already knew that they had to follow the code. If it's uncertain and if there's not political commitment, then developers will always, with the greatest respect, Andrew, to developers, I'm not talking about countryside, but developers will always chance their hand. They'll always say, let's push the limits a bit. Let's go putting a couple of floors on. Let's push the limits. And if you don't have that commitment, then you fight it all the way through the development management process. Political commitment, you can actually avoid that by having schemes come in a way which they respect the code before it all starts.
David, thank you for that. I'm going to draw this to a close now. And in terms of a summary, well, it's so difficult to summarize these things at the moment, isn't it? And I think we're at a stage where, there's a huge amount of positivity about the documents being produced, and a huge amount of, hope in terms that they have the desired effect on quality and outcomes. There's a lot riding on the pilots in terms of understanding that relationship and how things will actually be developed in anger, as it were, when things are taken out of the off the desk and actually put into the public domain to actually be tried out. The issue of resources, the issue of different tiers of government, all levels down to neighbourhood as well, and those relationships and how we engage the public and how we get that buy-in to whatever we produce, so that they feel that it's the right direction for their area, I think are all key things. And all these key things will no doubt be under the guise of new government bodies. I'm going to hand back to Nicholas to just talk a little bit about the Office for Place and the direction of travel over the next few months.
Thank you. For those who want huge detail, I've got a minute, so it won't be much. And also I can't front run, obviously, public announcements. But what I can say is, that was a, obviously huge thank you to all the panelists and to Andrew and Countryside for supporting. And thank you all for fascinating questions. I've been busy taking notes all the way through, because these are obviously the type of themes we will need to deal with. As has been publicly said, the Office for Place in a sort of transition form within the Ministry of Housing will be set up this year, I think, after the the new financial year. Precisely what our final form will be, we're still discussing, but we've got a range, I think, of interesting ideas. The sort of themes we'll need to be doing, very much reflecting, I think, particularly some of the points Esther was making. We want to obviously to work in a way that's empowering and flexible, and trying to think through how local communities and parish councils can be influencing effectively this, with that democracy brought forward. We won't have a magic wand to revolutionise the amount of capacity or funding. Certainly Office for Place won't. But you heard Andy say what he said. He's a senior official. Secretary of State said to me in a public speech, we hear that problem. So I think Office for Place will be about trying to work out how existing capacity, and hopefully more in future, can go as far as it can. How can people be parachuted in? What's the best advice? Research on what's working and not working, perhaps accrediting good approaches, certainly supporting them, getting funding for training, but I think very much funding the people who wish for the training rather than the trainers. So there's a proper market in good and effective and impactful training being there. Celebrating successes. There'll be failures in future, but there'll be successes as well. Sharing best practice, and then allowing that to percolate through. So those are the sorts of themes that I would imagine will become apparent as we are able to go public in more detail later in the year. That's it, promise. We're a minute over. I'd quickly say, I mean, we peaked, I think, at 381 and didn't decline from that for quite a long time. We are declining now because I'm talking, but so, you know, huge interest in this. For those who joined late or had to leave early, this will be available on the Create Street YouTube channel. Yes, we have such a thing with, you know, millions of subscribers, obviously, from later today. So do check in. And as I say, huge thank you to the panelists. Our next Planning Forward webinar is at 6 o'clock. So it's a glass of wine webinar, not a cup of coffee webinar. 6 o'clock on the 22nd of March. Also, I hope topical. Digital planning, what is it? How do we achieve it? Is it a big thing or is it hot air? With no panel could be as illustrious as expert as this, but almost as good. No, that's not fair, just as good. Thank you all very much and have a good day. And thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Countryside. Bye-bye.